Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal conflicts in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most decisive battles of the American Revolutionary War, the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. This epic confrontation marked a turning point in the war, as American and French forces combined to trap and defeat the British Army, paving the way for the eventual surrender of British General Charles Cornwallis and the effective end of the war. By 1781, the war had been raging for 6 years, with both sides experiencing significant victories and defeats. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, had suffered a series of setbacks in the Southern theater, including the loss of Charleston, South Carolina, to British forces in May 1780. However, Washington's strategic vision and perseverance had allowed him to maintain a formidable army in the field, ready to strike when opportunity arose. The landscape of war-torn America was bleak, with cities like Boston and New York bearing the scars of battle and the countryside ravaged by the constant march of armies. The once green fields of Virginia were now trampled and burned, as the conflict had become a war of attrition, with both sides seeking to wear down their opponent through sheer force of will. Yet, amidst this devastation, Washington's army remained a potent force, driven by a fierce determination to secure American independence. Meanwhile, the French, who had allied themselves with the Americans in 1778, were eager to capitalize on their investment in the war effort. King Louis XVI and his ministers saw an opportunity to weaken their longtime rival, Great Britain, and gain a strategic foothold in North America. The French had committed significant financial and military resources to the American cause, including the dispatch of troops under the command of the Comte Rochambeau, who arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, in July 1780. As the summer of 1781 approached, Washington and Rochambeau began to coordinate their efforts, seeking a decisive victory that would break the stalemate in the war. They set their sights on the British Army in Virginia, led by General Charles Cornwallis, who had been conducting a campaign of conquest in the southern colonies. Cornwallis's forces had been successful in defeating American troops at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, but he was now facing increasing pressure from American and French forces converging on his position. The British general, known for his tactical brilliance, had become overconfident in his abilities, and his decision to march into Virginia would ultimately prove to be a fatal mistake. As Cornwallis's army marched deeper into the heart of Virginia, they were met with increasing resistance from American militia and regular troops who employed hit-and-run tactics to harass and disrupt the British supply lines. In June 1781, Washington and Rochambeau launched a clever deception operation, pretending to prepare for an attack on British-occupied New York City. This ruse convinced British General Henry Clinton, commander of British forces in North America, that the main threat was to his stronghold in New York rather than to Cornwallis's army in Virginia. As a result, Clinton hesitated to send significant reinforcements to Cornwallis, leaving him vulnerable to the combined American and French forces gathering in Virginia. The deception operation was a masterstroke of strategic thinking, as it played on Clinton's fears and doubts, causing him to hesitate at a critical moment. Washington and Rochambeau had carefully crafted their plan, using spies and scouts to feed misinformation to British agents, and even going so far as to build fake military camps and trenches to convince Clinton that the main attack was indeed aimed at New York. In August 1781, Washington and Rochambeau set their armies in motion, marching south towards Virginia with a total of around 16,000 troops. They were joined by a fleet of French warships under the command of Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, who had sailed from the West Indies to blockade British naval forces in the Chesapeake Bay. This powerful armada would play a crucial role in the forthcoming battle, as it prevented British ships from reinforcing or evacuating Cornwallis's army. As the American and French armies approached Yorktown, they began to prepare for a siege, constructing earthworks and gathering artillery to breach the British defenses. Cornwallis, aware of the gathering storm, had fortified his position on the Yorktown Peninsula, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. As the American and French armies converged on Yorktown, they began to encircle the British defenses, cutting off any potential escape routes, like a vice tightening around Cornwallis's beleaguered army. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against the British, with the York River to their rear and the swampy terrain of the Virginia lowlands limiting their maneuverability. On September 28, 1781, Washington's troops occupied the high ground to the north of Yorktown, their lines stretching across the rolling hills like a dark, determined serpent. Meanwhile, Rochambeau's forces took positions to the west, their presence a constant reminder to Cornwallis that his army was surrounded and outnumbered. The French fleet under de Grasse blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, preventing British ships from reinforcing or evacuating Cornwallis's army. This masterful naval maneuver had been months in the making, with de Grasse carefully timing his arrival to coincide with the Allied land campaign. As a result, the British were forced to confront the unpalatable reality of their isolation. They were cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and any hope of escape. The Siege of Yorktown began in earnest on September 30, 1781, when American and French troops started constructing trenches and earthworks, gradually closing in on the British lines like a slow-moving, inexorable tide. The sound of pickaxes striking earth, the scent of freshly dug soil, and the sight of soldiers laboring under the hot Virginia sun all combined to create an atmosphere of relentless, grinding pressure. The British defenses were formidable, with a series of redoubts and fortifications that would need to be breached or outflanked if the Allies were to succeed. One of the most significant events of the siege occurred on October 9, 1781, when American and French artillery opened fire on the British positions, pounding their defenses with a relentless barrage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The cannonade was so heavy that it seemed as if the heavens themselves were raining down fury upon the British lines. As one observer noted, the cannonade was so heavy that it seemed as if the very earth itself was shaking. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of crashing guns, screaming shells, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air like a malignant fog. As the artillery bombardment continued, Washington's troops began to dig a series of trenches and saps, gradually extending their lines closer to the British defenses. The soldiers worked tirelessly, their sweat-drenched bodies laboring under the hot sun as they inched closer to their enemy. On October 11, 1781, American forces captured two key redoubts on the British right flank, giving them a crucial foothold for further advances. As the American and French troops continued to tighten their grip on the British defenses, Cornwallis realized that his situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The once proud British army, now outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, was on the brink of collapse. With each passing day, the noose around Yorktown grew tighter, as Washington's forces expertly orchestrated a siege that would ultimately decide the fate of the war. On October 14, 1781, the Allies launched a bold assault on the British lines, capturing two key redoubts on the British left flank in a daring display of tactical prowess. The night before the assault, American and French troops had gathered behind the lines, their faces set with determination as they prepared to face the enemy. The air was thick with anticipation, the only sound the soft murmur of hushed conversations and the occasional clanging of equipment being checked and rechecked. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the Allies emerged from the darkness, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun like a sea of steel. The British lines, initially steadfast, soon began to waver as the sheer weight of the Allied onslaught bore down upon them. The capture of the two redoubts marked a crucial turning point in the siege, as it allowed the Allies to gain control of the high ground and further weaken the British defenses. Cornwallis, realizing that his situation was now all but hopeless, knew that he had to act quickly to salvage what was left of his army. On October 16, 1781, he attempted to evacuate his troops across the York River, a desperate bid for freedom that would ultimately prove futile. A sudden storm, its fury unleashed upon the British fleet, ruined Cornwallis's plans, destroying his boats and forcing him to abandon the attempt. As the days passed, the British situation grew more dire, their soldiers weakened by hunger, thirst, and the relentless bombardment from the Allied lines. The stench of death and decay hung heavy over the battlefield, a grim reminder of the devastating consequences of war. Cornwallis, his options dwindling, was faced with the unpalatable reality of defeat. As one historian noted, the British army was trapped, and its commander knew it. The writing was on the wall, and Cornwallis, a seasoned soldier, could read the signs all too clearly. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis requested a ceasefire, and negotiations for surrender began. The British commander, his pride wounded but his sense of duty intact, knew that he had to act in the best interests of his troops. As the Allies and British negotiated the terms of surrender, the atmosphere was tense, the outcome far from certain. 2 days later, on October 21, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown, laying down their arms in defeat. The formal surrender ceremony took place on October 22, 1781, marking the effective end of the Siege of Yorktown. The Siege of Yorktown had been a brutal and devastating conflict, one that had pushed both sides to the limits of human endurance. Yet even in defeat, there was a sense of dignity, a recognition that the British soldiers had fought valiantly, if ultimately in vain. The consequences of the siege were far-reaching, its impact felt across the Atlantic. The British government, stunned by the loss at Yorktown, began to reassess its strategy, eventually deciding to negotiate a peace treaty with the Americans. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally ending the war and recognizing American independence. The news of the treaty sent shockwaves throughout Europe as the Old World struggled to come to terms with the emergence of a new nation, born from the ashes of rebellion and forged in the fire of freedom. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.